Gentle readers, welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay, and today we are going to talk biology. Just a few moments ago, Mr. Ajay Shah was telling me about a young female mosquito which got knocked up and came looking for mammalian proteins, but unfortunately collided with my jean pants. So nothing much is happening there. So let me tell you what this episode is about. In our course Life Lessons, we have a couple of webinars dedicated to the great phrase from ancient Greek philosophers, know thyself, right? And one of the ways in which we say know thyself is understand your hardwiring, understand the way you are, understand the way evolution shaped you, and also understand the way culture shaped you, which is a separate webinar entirely. And both of us have often within this show referred to natural selection and how it shapes us as human beings, how we can mitigate or amplify some of its effects. For example, in our episode on economic fallacies, we spoke about how those fallacies are natural. They were useful adaptations that emerged in the prehistoric times when we lived in small tribes as hunter-gatherers. And that's why they are there, but they are not fit for modern times. And this is a subject for different reasons both of us care about deeply. It shaped the way we look at the world, it shaped the way we look at ourselves. Ajay, tell me about your journey in discovering natural selection.
I was a PhD student of economics, and in those years, I just started getting more and more interested in biology and evolution. I remember a turning point was an article by Paul Ewald in the Scientific American on the evolution of virulence. We're going to talk a little bit about it later today, but it just blew my mind, and it was just a moment that you can't unsee. I also thought that there are some deep commonalities between the economist's way of thinking about understanding the forces through which a system evolves versus the evolutionary biologist's way of thinking. And so I got really fascinated and I geeked out and I read books, I started reading papers and so on. And it's been with me ever since that it's just a way to look at the world. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has described evolutionary theory as the universal acid that tears down a whole bunch of our simple preconceptions and takes us one level deeper on understanding the dynamics of what is going on in the working of the world. And I want to link to our favorite words, spontaneous order. When we say spontaneous order, oftentimes it's something mystical that we're not quite describing. It's a self-organizing system, millions of people choose and all that. Well, some systems that evolve through spontaneous order are shaped by simple natural laws, and the theory of evolution comes in.
There's a great book by Matt Ridley called The Evolution of Everything, and I did an episode with Matt on just that book where he describes exactly the same thing. It is the same bottom-up process of spontaneous order, no central planner, no grand designer, which is behind not just natural selection and therefore our emergence as human beings, but also languages, also society, also economies. And in a sense, that is a common link between what I consider the two great intellectual awakenings of my life. Like one of those intellectual awakenings was understanding how market works and the importance of freedom. I was fairly left-leaning in college. I would, carry marks to, to classes and all that. And it seemed to explain everything about the world until I began to look at the world more closely. And obviously then reading Friedman, Hayek and, all the great thinkers, Bastia, sort of made me appreciate the world in a different light. And similarly, my journey into natural selection actually came pretty late. I was into my adulthood by then, and I remember reading Steven Pinker's great book, The Blank Slate. And that book is a masterpiece, and it was also my window into evolutionary psychology and into natural selection as well. After that, I read everything by Richard Dawkins, everything by Daniel Dennett, everything by Robert Wright, all the thinkers who were, writing about that subject at the time. So it's a subject that is deeply close to me. And although I was never a believer in God as such, nevertheless, my atheism came into a comfort zone when I understood natural selection for the same reasons that Douglas Adams articulated so well when speaking about natural selection. He said, "The awe it inspired in me made the awe that people talk about in respect of religious experience seem frankly silly beside it. I take the awe of understanding over the awe of ignorance any day." And you can't unsee what you see once you understand natural selection and once you truly get it. And I think it's the same thing about understanding markets and spontaneous order and the positive sumness of the world. So, before we start talking about natural selection and sexual selection and giving illustrations and examples of how they work and talking about epigenetics and all of that, I just feel that at the start I want to clarify 5 important points, because there are plenty of misconceptions about natural selection, and natural selection at different points in time has been controversial. Both the right and the left, in different ways, for different reasons, have been deniers of evolution. And I want to address some of the misunderstandings around natural selection, and I'll you know present to you a number of statements. Statement one is that natural selection is independent of God or morality. In the Douglas Adams quote that I cited, he speaks about how God is no longer necessary in his worldview and indeed in mine, because you kind of, God evolves in a sense as a God of the gaps. It explains many things that can't otherwise be explained. Natural selection actually explains a lot of them beautifully. But in spite of that, I would say that actually, whether you believe in God or where you get your morality from has nothing to do with natural selection per se. One of the reasons natural selection was so controversial among the right is that you had a particular view of the world in which God was central, and suddenly that was no longer necessary, and they couldn't handle that. William Ghisselin once remarked, people couldn't handle the radical departure from the Western intellectual tradition that was implicit in Darwin's new cosmology, a world populated by organisms striving to no end, but rather playing ridiculous sexual games, a world in which the brain is itself an extension of the gonads, simply cannot be reconciled with the old way of thinking. And the old way of thinking also used the complexity of nature to justify the existence of God. William Paley, in fact, wrote a book where he made the argument of the watchmaker, right? And his watchmaker argument is basically this, that you are walking on a beach somewhere or in some deserted place somewhere, and you come across a watch, right? And you pick up the watch. And the watch, in some ways, is distinct from a stone, the way he puts it. It is intricately designed. It works perfectly. Everything is awesome about it, at least until the battery runs out. And even batteries are awesome. And his point there is that a watch like that, unlike a stone, cannot just exist by itself. It cannot be accidental. Someone has designed the watch and someone has created it, and intricate work has gone into it. And his point is that similarly, nature is remarkable. He talks about the human eye, for example, and says that nature is so remarkable that it is inconceivable that it could exist by accident, right? It had to come about because of a grand designer, and that designer has to be God. And this is a whole creationist argument, as it were, that you need a god for it to come about. And in some senses, Darwin made the existence of a metaphorical watchmaker irrelevant. What the theory of natural selection shows is that through complete randomness, through random events and accidents of nature, you can have something beautiful and intricate, like indeed the human eye, come into being. You don't need God to explain this, right? And once you understand natural selection, you get it that actually true complexity arises beautifully by spontaneous order in a bottom-up way rather than from a top-down intervention from some God. This doesn't mean that there is no God. If you wish to believe in God, you could easily say that God is so cool, he created this process called natural selection. You and I don't believe that, but that is a way out. Natural selection is just so beautiful and awesome that it is independent of the question of whether there is God, and it is also independent of the question of morality, as I will talk about in my next point.
I think the way Newton tried to argue with himself and reconcile these ideas was that earlier people believed that God chose the precise location and orbit of Jupiter and all that. Whereas Newton said, no, there are these universal laws. Okay? God made the law, F equal to GMM upon R squared. There's no good reason for that law to exist. So God made the laws and he got a system going, and then the system whirled along. And we are humble and joyous at deciphering the works of God, because then we understand F equal to GMM upon R squared. It's a glorious moment in our life where we understand the machine that is in motion around us. Another way to think about it is that all you need is to get to self-replicating molecules, because then everything else in biology is more or less inevitable. Once you get to self-replicating molecules, and you do need the complexities of the biochemistry of DNA. uh, It's not trivial to get to self-replicating molecules. But once you get to self-replicating molecules, the rest of natural selection, the discovery, the invention of sexual reproduction, sexual selection, ever escalating complexity, capabilities, all those things are just inevitable. And the magic was just that initialization. So we could put God at those kinds of deeper roles, maybe all the way to the Big Bang. In the beginning, there was nothing. God said, let there be light. There was a big bang. Okay, it is possible to come up with those stories, and your mileage may vary. Different people may choose to do this differently. The second thing I want to say is, just as you were speaking, I thought of an analogy. Okay, I thought of a pencil. So level 0 is a person who thinks that pencils are easy to make. Okay, then level 1 is a person who gets eye pencil, who understands, my God, this is so amazing, it is mind-boggling what it takes to make a pencil, or what it takes to make a shirt, or what it takes to make a wristwatch. Then level 2 is a person who thinks that this is so complicated, it must require a Gauss plan. Okay, the only way to do this is to have a central committee of the party that will instruct everybody, will do central planning and instruct people, you need so much aluminum and so much steel, and dude, you have to transport the steel from here to here and all that. And the highest level where you have arrived in understanding the world is to understand that we can actually make pencils out of thin air, and it's called a self-organizing system.
How many equations do you know by heart, by the way? My second point is, beware of two fallacies. They're called the is-ought fallacy and the naturalistic fallacy. And let me explain this and why I think it's so important, especially in these times, to point this out. The is-ought fallacy is a fallacy which was first spoken about and articulated by the philosopher David Hume. And the fallacy is that you end up deriving an ought from an is, that you get to something prescriptive from something descriptive, that you say that just because something is this way, it ought to be this way. And this is a great error, because you can look at something in human nature and you say that, oh, men are typically like this, or women are typically like this, and therefore this is a right way to be. Nature designed us this way and we should be this way. And this is a logical leap. This is not a leap that you need to make. That yes, nature has designed us in, or I mean, I'm sort of being anthropomorphic when I use the term nature has designed, and I will come to the importance of language later. But yes, we are hardwired in a particular way due to literally accidents of nature. But that doesn't mean that that is a good way to be. What is good, what is right, is up to us to decide. We are indeed the only species that can do this, that can apply our rationality to figuring out what is right and what is wrong. So one does not follow from the other. This is super important. A related fallacy to this, and I often invoke them together, but they don't always have to be together, is a naturalistic fallacy. This is a term coined by G.E. Moore in the early 20th century. And the naturalistic fallacy is to define good in terms of what is natural. So if there is a particular behavior or a particular attribute which is natural, then you define good according to that and say that this is natural and therefore it is good. There were bigots of another age who, for example, argued against homosexuality by saying that it is not natural, therefore it cannot be good. Not only is that a leap and you're committing the naturalistic fallacy, but homosexuality is actually completely natural, not just in humans but across many species. And we will talk about this in some detail in future episodes. But so the naturalistic fallacy is also something to avoid, right? So they're related. In one, you derive an ought from an is. Because something is a particular way, you say it should be that way because, hey, we're designed this way. And in the other, you define what is good according to what is natural. Both are wrong. And the reason I say that this is pertinent to modern times is that many people in modern times commit this fallacy in different ways from both the right and the left. Like one of my principal objections to Jordan Peterson among many is that I feel he commits a naturalistic fallacy. That he looks back at time and he says, oh, women have always played this role in society, men have played this role, and therefore men should be like this and women should be like whatever. And descriptively, he might be correct. And you can argue about that, but there is no reason to get a prescription out of that and then to insist upon that. But leave that aside for a moment. The left also makes this mistake in a big way, in the sense that over the last few decades it's become politically incorrect to speak of differences between men and women. Somehow we have to pretend that men and women are exactly the same, or different races are exactly the same, and all of that. And what they are doing, in a sense, is committing both these fallacies when they object to descriptions of nature that show differences, right? To point out a difference between men and women is not to say that they are unequal, is not to prescribe that they be treated unequally. Men and women should be treated equally. That is something that is a part of culture, that is a part of, should be a part of our intellectual scaffolding, right? But to recognize that there are differences between them, and that is perfectly okay, but otherwise both have full agency and should be equal in every way. These are two separate things. If you are to argue, as many have, and there is, and you can argue about the basis for it, but if you say men tend to be better at math and women tend to be better at languages and multitasking, you can argue about those statements at a descriptive level. Is it true or not? What does the data show? What is the role of nature? What is the role of nurture? But to a lot of the dismissal of those is instinctive, because you assume that, oh, so and so person wants to create divisions in society and treat people differently. And I think that is a dangerous way to look at it. If we want to respect every individual, understand what makes us what we are, understand every individual, give importance to individual agency, it's important to kind of accept the ways that we are hardwired, and then we can think about how we want to mitigate it or amplify it. This also becomes important, and particularly the naturalistic fallacy begins to play a part in eugenics, right? Eugenics was something in the early 20th century. It was a massive problem, and it was a problem again both on the right and the left. The classic example of eugenics is, of course, of Adolf Hitler trying to, refashion his society along racial grounds. But plenty of giants of the left, including people like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, both Fabian socialists, both an inspiration for Nehru, they also believed in eugenics. So it was like a combination of committing the naturalistic fallacy or the Izod fallacy and the engineering mindset. A man of system, as Adam Smith would have put it, where you say that, okay, we are going to redesign society in this way. And that's deeply disturbing and dangerous. And part of what many people today do is that every time you describe human nature in a particular way, they commit the same fallacy, or they assume that the fallacy is inherent in the statement. And they'll have fears of eugenics, and they'll be like, oh, description of difference is implying a prescription of unequal treatment, and that is not the case. So it's important to tell you, gentle readers, that when we talk about human nature, do not commit this fallacy. A description of something doesn't imply a prescription of anything, so don't commit the Izod fallacy or the naturalistic fallacy. It is up to us, through intellectual debate and discussion, to speak about morality, to decide what is good and what is bad. Nature does not have a part to play in that. Nature can be both a constraint or an enabler, but it shouldn't shape our morality. My third statement is that nature and nurture are not a binary. There have been too many nature versus nurture arguments, and that versus should not be there. We are shaped by both nature and nurture. I love this quote by Steven Pinker, though I've never been able to find it. I just remember that Pinker said this or wrote this somewhere, but I've never been able to find it. Even AI hasn't helped me in that regard, but I'm pretty sure it's him, where he said, nature gives you knobs, nurture turns them. Right? And what that means is that we are all hardwired in different ways. I may be more predisposed to anger than you are, but my life could be relatively peaceful, and I could have a cultural environment where that knob is not turned much, so I don't get angry much, it's controlled against. And equally, you could be someone who gets angry very little, the knob isn't really there, but your life is nasty, brutish and hard, and you keep losing your cool all the time. You keep meeting Bengali economists and you can't help shouting at them. So, we have different kinds of knobs, and nature turns them in different ways, and that interaction between nature and nurture is inescapable. And interestingly, various people, whenever they sort of bring it up and talk about both, it is interpreted by proponents of one extreme side or the other that, they are taking an extreme position. That anyone talks about biology, it will be assumed that they're talking about, that they're saying nature is everything, that they're being deterministic, and vice versa. And the truth is, most nuance thinkers understand that it is a combination of both of them. And this is important to recognize, because because we are hardwired in really deep ways that we have to strive to understand. And then the role of nurture, the role of culture, is to mitigate or amplify the hardwiring according to values that we have arrived at by thinking about them. In my mind, this is the whole enlightenment project, right? That you figure out what is the right way to live, and then you look at your hardwiring and you mitigate certain aspects of it that you don't like, and you amplify the aspects of it that you do like. And this is how we should think of nature and nurture, that that we are a cocktail of both of them, and as long as we are aware, self-aware of the ways in which we are shaped by them, is perfectly fine.
I want to say two things here. The first is I have an idea on why most of us are likely to overstate our assessment of the role of nature. Okay, the idea is like this, that nature and nurture are correlated. So in a household where you've got a bunch of people who play hockey, there is something about the genes which may support explosive strength and athletic capability. But then the environment also involves parents talking to kids about hockey and getting them playing hockey early in life. So you'll end up with a correlation that in such a household, there's a higher chance that the kids will also grow up being pretty good at hockey. Or if by dumb luck, there was a kid who had the right kinds of talents, then all the right praise and coaching and support would have happened for that kid, and that kid would blossom as being very good at hockey. This combination of nature and nurture makes us overstate how important nature is. Actually, what you see as the apparent transmission of capabilities across generations is a mixture of nature and nurture. And because we don't think about this in an intellectually clear way, we tend to think, oh, nature, that there is some genes for chess in this family. The second great example that all of us should think about is the way in which our nature was fine-tuned by an evolutionary process to solve for certain problems around diet, around anxiety, and around tribalism. In the primitive times when humans were being forged, food was in short supply. So we developed the hardware to be obsessed with high calorie food, and we would take high fat, high sugar food at every opportunity that we got. Similarly, threats in that world were really life threatening. If a lion charges you, you don't have time for a balanced response. You have to have fight or flee getting triggered extremely rapidly. And finally, tribalism. We lived in bands of a median size of 150 people, and everybody else was the other. So others were dangerous, others were evil, others might kill us. My 150 people, my tribe. Okay, so these things are our nature, and we should recognize that these things are there in our nature. However, the nature does not exclusively call the shots. We have a great layer on top of it, which is the operating system, which is our culture. And we can become self-aware about these things, and we can reshape our life to eat less fat, to eat less sugar, to not respond with an extreme of fight or flee when a boss sends you a bad email. You don't have to respond like it is an attack by a tiger. In fact, you don't even have to respond right now. It's okay to respond after 2 hours. Be calm, relax. These things are not as big as they feel. So, that's culture. That's our modern upbringing, that it's our modern cultural package, where we have learned that you don't need to be so anxious. You don't need to fly off the handle. Actually, presume good faith. Most things that happen are fairly minor and unimportant. And similarly for tribalism. It's a modern cultural idea that we can engage with our imagined communities all across the world who are not genetically correlated with us, and we can form our own friendships and relationships, and we don't have to look at the world through the lens of tribalism. Gentle readers who are tired and bored of everything is everything, where we say the same lines over and over. We are large, we contain multitudes, so we engage with different people on different things. All that is culture. Okay? I mean, if you would just go with the grain, maybe we should all be little tribals with an extended family of 150 people, where we zealously guard them with a sword and we will hit at every outsider. So I think these are simple ways in which we should all understand that there is nature, It is wrong to deny that there is nature, and it is wrong to fail to see the role of nurture and our own agency in reshaping our culture so that we build us as a character designed on a white piece of paper that we might be proud of.
And these are great examples of exactly the point I was making, that culture can amplify or mitigate, these different ways in which we are hardwired. For example, I think what has accidentally happened in over the last 10, 15 years is that giant social media companies trying to maximize engagement have instead ended up amplifying our tribalistic instincts. And as the rain pours down on us, it is up to us to consider that the rain too will stop and we can reverse this trend. All right, on to my point four. But first, I must point out that yes, we have indeed moved indoors because it was raining outside. And under the pressure of natural selection, my shirt changed into a hoodie. Isn't it miraculous how these things work? So, my fourth statement is don't mistake proximate causation for ultimate causation. Now, what do I mean by this? Often, what happens is that when we talk about natural selection, why we have evolved in a particular way, people might get confused about the why. The why that we are referring to is why the genes that led to that behavior or that adaptation evolved in that particular way in prehistoric times 100,000 years ago. They don't necessarily relate to why we do something today in the present day. For example, something that evolutionary biologists will often point out is that they might come up with a statement like men are attracted to youth in women because that is a sign of good health and childbearing capacity, right? Or they might say women are attracted to tall men because it indicates a greater likelihood of that person being a high status male. And a man can listen to this and he can protest and say that, hey, look, I might like young women or whatever, but that's not because I was never thinking of childbearing capacity. I don't even want to have any kids. Or a woman can say that, look, I might like someone because he's a nice guy. It has nothing to do with the status. What are you even talking about? And there will, of course, be outliers in both directions. But the point being made here is that what an objection like that would do is confuse proximate causation with ultimate causation. The ultimate causation for a particular behavioral trait might arise because of a particular reason, because it gave you an advantage in that environment, right? But it doesn't mean that you feel like that now. A lot of the things that we do, there are layers and layers of reasons behind it. Some of those layers of reasons have to do with, chemical imbalances or different aspects of ourselves we might not even be aware of. And some go back to prehistoric times where a tendency can be adapted for, selected for in a particular way because of reasons that applied then. And I find that this is a mistake that a lot of people make, that when you say that I am this way because of this, you say that, hey, that isn't, I don't feel like that at all. I can, for example, say that, Ajay Shah, you have a sweet tooth because whenever you see calories, you want to load up on them, right? And that is the reason your sweet tooth evolved, because in prehistoric times, whenever you got calories, it made a lot of sense to just take them in for future use. Calories were scarce. That is no longer the case in the modern environment. You are not thinking about the scarcity of calories when you eat your next laddu, right? So for you to then make that objection would be confusing proximate with ultimate causation. And we have to kind of keep this in mind when we talk about natural selection. And in a sense, language plays a part in this, which is related to my next point.
On this, I want to add that when we think about human beings, we think about ourselves. The voice going on in our head, our model of the world, our cognitive capacity applied to the things that we see, is all but one small part of the brain, traditionally called the neocortex. Modern thinking has diverged to a significant extent. But the model of the world is just another evolutionary adaptation. The neocortex evolved to feel good, to feel comfortable, to feel a sense of purpose, to be able to go out and find food and fight off the predators and keep the being going. There are many things happening at a deeper level that we are not aware of. So at a trivial other extreme, there is complicated circuitry which makes the heart beat. There is complicated circuitry which makes sure that as your level of physical exertion changes, the cardiovascular system produces more or less oxygen. It doesn't happen consciously. Our mind doesn't know that that is happening. it is happening. So there are many parts of the human mind and behavior that are not sent to our formal conscious understanding of the world. So if a person will say, I didn't drive up my heart rate when I was running, says, yeah, you didn't know it, but there are deeper things going on in your body that you only dimly understand.
My fifth statement is be careful of semantic confusion. The language we use matters. Donald Simons once pointed out in his book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, that science expands knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily expand language. And you and I have seen this in the context of economics. We've commented many times that it is almost as if we take common words for English and we give it a particular technical meaning within the context of a subject. But then the person outside of that subject, the layperson, is apt to misunderstand. For example, the term public goods, right? Or the term market failure, or the term
Public health.
public health, right? So common people are people who are outside the field can just simply misunderstand all of these, and then that becomes a problem, like the term rent seeking. That becomes a problem because they are just applying the word in an English language kind of way and thinking, oh, this is what it must mean, and using common sense, but it means something else entirely. And that's happened in biology as well. For example, the neuroscientist Paul MacLean once pointed to many such words that are used in the context of biology, such as when we talk about genes, we talk about messengers and promoters and operators and master genes and slave genes. And if you just try to apply English language reasoning and common sense to it, you're going to get it wrong if you don't know the subject. So it's important to be aware of the ways in which we use language, which is useful to talk about in this context because a lot of the language that is used when we talk about natural selection can tend to be either metaphorical or anthropomorphic. Metaphorical in the sense of the selfish gene, for example, right? It is a fantastic metaphor by Richard Dawkins, his landmark 1975 book. But if you kind of take it literally and if you assume from that human beings are designed to be selfish, again, mistaking ultimate and proximate causation in a way, then it's a problem and it's not quite true, and you've got a simplistic understanding of what's going on. So that's something we need to watch out for. Equally, there is a danger of anthropomorphic language. Anthropomorphic means that when you look at the natural or inanimate world and you ascribe it a human quality by using verbs like my gene wants to do this, right? Now, literally a gene is not selfish. It has no motivation. It doesn't want to do anything. It's a metaphor that is being used, that it behaves in this way that makes it appear as if it wants this, but it doesn't want this. And sometimes you can kind of get carried away with that language, and that language can be obfuscatory. And that's in fact another reason those misunderstandings between proximate and ultimate causation happen. So that's something we got to be a little bit on the watch for.
So in fact, simple selfish gene type reasoning takes us all the way to understanding how humans are actually quite altruistic. But you do need to go through the rigor of the scientific understanding to get to that conclusion. So a crude reading of the word selfish gene and jumping to conclusions for what is sought to be said will get you to the exactly wrong answer.
Exactly. And there's a great book called The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod, where he uses a little bit of game theory and also, talks in depth about natural selection to point out why we have evolved to cooperate with each other, why we have evolved to be altruistic. There's a lot of literature on how we've evolved to sacrifice ourselves for the tribe. And if you just think of us as selfish beings, that doesn't seem to make sense from a person point of view, but it makes a lot of sense from the gene point of view, and we'll double down on that later.
Somewhere in this, there is a fallacy that is worth bringing out with a technical name. That's teleological reasoning. The idea that the evolutionary process has an objective and the evolutionary process is trying to get somewhere. No. Evolution only cares about fitness. It will randomly try changing one thing after another till it gets to something that works better in the sense of natural selection. There is no objective. So Mother Evolution did not try to make the wonder that is the human eye or the eagle's eye. There is no Mother Evolution, and this non-existent Mother Evolution has no objective at all other than just a play of resources and genes.
And see, this is where language becomes a problem. That you just said that evolution doesn't care about X, so evolution only cares about Y. And evolution actually doesn't care, but the metaphor is important so you understand the direction in which things are moving. So I will add a sixth statement to my fifth statement, which is that evolution doesn't have a purpose. So Ajay, now that we've got these clarifications out of the way and spoken about the concepts that we did, let's get down to the mechanics of how natural selection works.
All that you need is that there are certain organisms who will make copies of themselves, okay, through some process. It could be sexual reproduction, it could be asexual reproduction, it could be firms giving birth to firms, or whatever. There are some organisms and they have some characteristics, and those characteristics vary. That's all. So there is a landscape where there are organisms that like to replicate, and they are in competition for resources, and they vary. That's all. The moment you have that, there will be competition, because there is a finite amount of resources, and each of these organisms would like to take up more resources and make more copies of itself. Then the ability of the organism to manage the environment, to find the resources and make copies of itself, will be selected for. That if a organism is less capable of utilizing energy, of utilizing matter and making copies of itself, then it will make fewer copies of itself. And if there is an organism which does better at that, it will make more copies of itself. And so the ideas and the knowledge and the capabilities that are embedded in certain organisms will tend to proliferate more. That's all. That is natural selection. There's nothing more, nothing less. It is inexorable. That the moment you have self-replicating organisms that compete in finding resources, you've got a natural selection process going on, because there's no equality in that. It's a competitive process. Some organisms get resources, make copies. Some organisms don't get resources, don't make copies. And the concept of natural selection is that out of that competition, certain traits will succeed, certain traits will get emphasized. It'll happen slowly. So generation after generation, certain traits will get refined, and we will go towards ever-present competition. So it doesn't end. There is no objective, there is no destination. You're just in an endless war where different traits are competing with each other, and they will grow and get refined to fiendish levels of excellence, but that doesn't mean it ends. Evolution never ends. There is no apex outcome, there is no destination. There is just an endless process of traits that compete to capture resources, to make copies, and that will go on till kingdom come.
And a quick illustration of this, if I may, really comes from what we were talking about earlier, about your having a sweet tooth, right? Let us imagine that you have a bunch of people living in a tribe back in the day. And in the landscape, you have fruits, and in the landscape, you have poisonous plants, right? Now, if you happen to have a sweet tooth, if your genes have evolved in such a way that you like sweet things, you are more likely to stock up on calories and eat those fruits, and therefore, you are more likely to survive and to spread your genes, and your genes will contain that sweet tooth. Equally, if you have a gene that gives you an aversion towards bitterness, you are more likely to avoid poisonous plants. That, the contrary to this is, if you happen to like bitter things for whatever reason, through a mutation in the gene, because all of these are accidental mutations through which nature is playing out. And if you happen to have a mutation and you happen to like, the bitter taste of things, you could actually eat something poisonous and die, and your gene is back. It's gone out of there. So there is less likelihood of that preference for bitter things actually, proliferating. So more and more you will find that people will like sweet things, people will not like bitter things, and of course there will be variations, there will be outliers. In modern times, bitter things are not necessarily poisonous, and both of these are unnecessary adaptations. And therefore, culturally, we have evolved in really different ways. Augie Yogas and Sai Gaddam have this great book I'll talk about in the next episode, where they have a great quote which talks about how culture plays a part in shaping taste as well. That is not just sweet, good, bitter, bad. And that illustrates a point we were making about nature and nurture. So I'll read it out here. They write, Even though all foods can be reduced to a handful of taste cues, the taste combinations we prefer are influenced by both culture and experience. We like pork chops or curry because that's what mom made. Most Americans don't like braised cow tongues because they were never exposed to them growing up, though they are a common Filipino dish. College students eat a lot of hot pockets because they are cheap and easy to prepare. We can learn to appreciate food that is bitter, like coffee or olives, but no culture enjoys cinnamon sprinkled feces. So that's one engine of evolution, natural selection. Tell us also about another super important engine, sexual selection.
So early on, the first organisms that existed made copies of themselves without sexual reproduction. Okay, and this is perfectly feasible. So it is possible for an amoeba to divide itself, and you get two amoebas, and they are very like the original one that they started from. So the variation levels are very low. Now, this turns out to not work too well when compared with an incredible innovation that happened some 3 billion years ago, which is where self-replicating creatures started having sex with each other. And that is important because it shuffles the genes. So it brings new levels of variation. It increases the amount of variation. It allows good genes, bad genes to interplay, and new kinds of features to arise. So it increases the variation of features that are then presented into the process of natural selection. So first, this was the importance of the invention of sex, that sexual reproduction increased variation in interesting ways compared with asexual reproduction. But by the time you get to more complex creatures, it becomes efficient for the organisms to optimally choose the partner with which the offspring will be made. So now you have one more engine of evolution, which is sexual selection, that we make babies through a process of assortative mating, through a process of choice, and the male mind, the female mind are applied into analyzing the world and looking at other organisms and choosing. So this becomes one more engine through which natural selection is supplemented by sexual selection. So it's not as if only natural selection happens, there is also sexual selection. The characteristics, the features that are more desired by the opposite sex tend to succeed more, and then more copies of those land up in the next generation. So this is the second engine of evolution, which is sexual selection. So as an example, consider the springbuck, an deer-like animal in Africa. When they are chased, they have an insane jump. They jump very, very high. Now, you'd think, why is that so important? You're just running away from a lion or a leopard. Why do you need to jump like that high in the air? And it turns out that that's a way of signaling to persons of the opposite sex that, hey, I'm so healthy, that I have energy to spare, and I have incredible muscles, and I'm able to jump. And that jumping is part of their sexual selection process. And once this kind of selection happens, then it's a trait that's selected for. And suddenly, generation after generation, they're jumping higher and higher. And you can see that that is actually wasting energy, and it makes it easier for the lion to catch that springbuck who jumps 3 meters in the air. Then the lion will stand there and wait for the springbuck to fall. So in fact, natural selection and sexual selection are at odds with each other, and that can also happen.
So I guess evolution among the springboks could then be called a race to the top.
In the problem of nature and nurture, where we think of environment as turning the knobs, it's interesting and important to say how. Okay, what is the mechanism by which that happens? At first, we might think that hiding inside every human cell, there is a DNA, the DNA is fixed, and so then are all the characteristics of that human inevitably programmed? Because at birth, there is 2 billion letters of that DNA, and then nothing else is left to chance. How might nurture work? How might the environment work? This takes us to a beautiful, relatively modern field that is called epigenetics. So epigenetics is about gene expression. It is the mechanism of gene expression, where environmental factors interact with the code that is written on the DNA and generate different effects. So that code is not fixed. The code is not certainty. It is not inevitable that given that code you will get a certain outcome. The environment interplays the translation of the DNA into characteristics of the creature, and the deep dive into that process of gene expression is called epigenetics. One of the most famous studies of this field is about the uh, famine in Amsterdam in 1944. So in 1944 there was a rebellion around Amsterdam, and the Nazis chose to cut off all the roads to starve Amsterdam as a punishment. And the Allies desperately started airdropping food into Amsterdam because people understood that there was an atrocity, a war crime that was in progress. But it was an absolutely terrible time, and there was a great famine in Amsterdam. Many, many years later, the scientists went back and started looking at the kids who were born in that famine. And you think of the people who were born before and after the famine as fully intact. And then there is a varying level of exposure to famine from the moment of conception to the moment of birth. And you think through all the steps that happen here. And the answer is the epigenetic story worked out here, that because in those early beginnings there was starvation, the children that were born out of their exposure to starvation had much more of a propensity to obesity. So it's like the sweet tooth. And yet you see it's intermediated by the environment, meaning all of us have some DNA. But if in the very early experiences of the embryo, there is a relative availability of nutrition and things are fine, then that child that gets created, the child that is fabbed in a high nutrition environment, has a more relaxed approach. But with that same DNA, if the child experiences starvation in that early period, then that child behaves differently, it hoards food more desperately, and they have a propensity to obesity. And these things were passed down for several generations, which is a weirdly Lamarckian idea. And I know you're going to take us to that in a moment.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because people often misunderstand this as being similar to Lamarckism, right? Lamarckism is, in fact, a friend of mine recently told me that, if I work out really well and I live a disciplined lifestyle, then my kid could inherit those properties. And I was like, no, he can pick them up from you by watching you do all those things, but they're not going to be part of his DNA. Now, Lamarckism is the idea that if you make some physical change to yourself in your lifetime, that gets passed on through your genes. For example, a blacksmith will have strong arms, and those arms will get passed on to the kid. Or you'll build your body and that will get passed on. Or you'll do some kind of behavioral thing, change in yourself, and then that will get passed on through the genes. And, this was a common belief in the 19th century, especially, before genetics really evolved as a field and people didn't really know the mechanics of natural selection. But now we know there's absolutely nothing to it, and we shouldn't take it seriously. And it's important to say that what Lamarckism believes is that a behavioral change that you make will change your DNA, and therefore the DNA that is passed on to your kid. We know that doesn't happen. That's not what epigenetics is about. Epigenetics did not change the DNA of the kids who were born at that time. It merely turned the knobs differently. Everyone has some kind of propensity towards sweetness, and what the famine did was, in the kids who were deprived of food in the womb, it just turned that knob up full. And then those kids ended up, eating a lot of laddus, if laddus were ever in Amsterdam, or, and so on and so forth. So that's an important distinction to make, because I think people often misunderstand how these processes play out.
When I was growing up, my sister had a classmate who was the daughter of the wrestler Dara Singh. Okay, and this daughter was very strong. And my father used to use this as an example to teach us about Lamarckism, that yes, there was a certain amount of nature that was transmitted, but it is not the bodybuilding that Dara Singh did in order to become a successful wrestler. It was there in his genes at birth, and there is a correlation of nurture, that she's in a household that prizes physicality and strength, and she's probably doing a lot of exercise, and so she's very strong. But it's not Lamarckism.
This reminds me of a famous quote by Kapil Dev. Kapil Dev, at his peak, at a press conference, perhaps when he was close to retirement, was asked mournfully by a reporter. The reporter was mournful, saying, "Sir, you will retire soon. How can we get another Kapil Dev?" And Kapil's response was that my father is dead, my mother is too old. So, Ajay, at this point, we've spoken about how the mechanism works and given maybe one or two examples, but I want more examples of natural selection and sexual selection at work. Give me some more examples.
The examples are wild. Let's get started. Okay, so the first of them, I want to tell a story about sickle cell anemia and thalassemia. These are inherited diseases. Let me describe sickle cell anemia more carefully. The red blood corpuscle normally looks like this. And when a person goes to high cardiac output, when you go closer to VO max, the moon-shaped red blood corpuscle collapses into like a crescent moon. It becomes like a sickle, okay? And its working gets compromised, and such people have an abrupt collapse of their cardiac output when they are pushing their hearts. And it feels like a horribly maladaptive thing, because you know the leopard was chasing you, you tried running hard, and boom, you crashed on the ground because you were hit by the sickling of the red blood corpuscles. So this was long considered like a bad idea. Why would this be selected? Like, this should have just died out. This trait should have died out. And similarly is thalassemia, which is also about a malfunctioning of the red blood corpuscles. Many years later, the scientists understood deeply what was going on. It turns out that thalassemia and sickle cell anemia are selected for in environments with malaria. Okay, the plasmodium of malaria hides inside the red blood corpuscle, where they are immune from the human immune system. So the human immune system is floating everywhere in the body. It's in the blood, but it does not go inside an RBC. So the malaria plasmodium sits safe inside the red blood corpuscle, and it makes copies of itself, and at some point the RBC shatters and the plasmodiums go out into the body. And this is really rough. What is an immune system going to do? Now you can see the adaptive value of sickle cell anemia, that when the RBC becomes that sickle shape, if there are malaria plasmodiums inside that, their life becomes difficult and their survival gets compromised. So now you have this tension between peak cardiac capability and the ability to outrun a leopard or fight against hostile males from the next tribe, versus the adaptation that gives you a little better survival when faced with malaria. And that balancing act was done by the evolutionary process. And so you have entire communities and populations in India who have sickle cell anemia, who have thalassemia, and it was just an adaptation to the problem of malaria.
I have a title for the short story: The Lion and the Mosquito.
Who runs faster, the lion or the mosquito? The second example that I want to talk about is the ability to utilize milk in your food. Milk contains a sugar that is called lactose, and the enzyme that processes lactose is called lactase. Okay, now all mammals have lactase as infants, because when you are being nursed by your mother, you need the ability to process milk, and milk contains lactose, so infants are able to make lactase. But as you grow up, you lose the ability to create lactase. Many years ago, maybe 7,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, on the border between Bulgaria and Turkey, one mutation took place where people as adults had an enhanced ability to make lactase. So this gene is called lactase persistence. Now, this was an enormous innovation, because suddenly as an adult, you were able to use high quality nutrition, that is milk. And you also see the interplay between biology, as in the hardware, and the culture, because once people found that, oh, I can actually drink milk, you actually created entire cow owning and cow herding and cow oriented cultures, because you could utilize milk. Okay, so that was a brilliant innovation, and the people who did this succeeded. It worked very well for them. They reproduced successfully and they conquered vast lands in faraway places, including the northern parts of India. Okay, so when you look at the map of India, the gene for lactase persistence is present much more in the north, where we had these invasions, versus the south, where we did not. And this is another beautiful example of evolution, where there was a mutation that was selected by natural selection, and then the culture turned around and exploited that. So there was a combination of a mutation and cultural adaptation, which led to great genetic success. Okay, you see this full story in the ability of some of us as adults to drink milk.
And the people who get messed up are the lactose intolerant people who do not have this gene, but they're in a culture where it's rose like, "Aap doodh kyun nahi peete?"
My next example comes from Korea. There is a place, Amit, called Jeju Island. Are you going to visit? Okay.
I'm going to visit. I love diving there with the women. They are called Hinyu women. Have you heard of them?
Yes. So there are women there who dive into the deep sea for pearls. Okay, that became the dominant livelihood of the people there, and it's been going on for hundreds of years. Boom, lo and behold, you will get a natural selection process, because the people who are able to hold their breath and process oxygen and deal with the pressure of diving in the deep sea will be able to go deep down and get the pearls and come back. Whereas the people who are less adapted to this will just tend to have accidents and die. So over hundreds of years, these women have developed remarkable physical adaptations through which they are better able to engage in deep sea diving and cope with all that stress. And it is eerie, a bit similar to the Sherpas of the high Himalayan mountains, who have unbelievable abilities to deal with low oxygen.
This also reminds me of how all the top long distance runners in the world, especially in marathons, tend to come from East Africa, like Kenya and Ethiopia, because of a variety of factors: the altitude, the natural terrain, and no doubt culture feeds into that and amplifies that. But they are so good at that that you simply cannot beat them. And I think there might be a correlation with West Africa and sprinters also. I'm not sure of that one, but East Africa and long distance. So that's exactly the same thing in play, that you have your genes evolving over time and certain attributes being selected for in certain places before we are a globalized world.
The next example I want to talk about is a important example from history. When the debates around evolution first came up, here is a brilliant example that was used right in the earliest debates. This is about the color of moths and the Industrial Revolution. So originally moths in Britain were white or off-white. Okay. Then came the Industrial Revolution and bad quality furnaces for burning coal, which emitted soot. Okay, which we also see all over India, where there is bad quality burning which creates black ugly smoke, and then that soot would land on buildings and buildings just became black. The buildings were covered in black. Now if the building is black, then a white moth will stick out and the birds would swoop down and grab a white moth who is sitting on a black building. So sure enough, there was selection pressure, mutations happened, the darker moths survived better, and within a couple of decades, the moths of Industrial Revolution England turned black. Okay, so this is another clear example of natural selection happening in front of your eyes, and people were able to see these changes, and this example played a very big role in the early arguments around natural selection.
And let me also sort of belabor this point so that I can break down for you, gentle readers, how the whole process works. That there are moths, they tend to be white. Now, accidentally, there will always in every generation, there will be mutations and there will be some black ones as well. And in this particular time, because the buildings tend to be covered with soot and all that, the black ones become more likely to survive because they are getting consumed at a lower rate and they can reproduce faster. And then over a couple of generations, they spread their genes much better, and that mutation therefore almost becomes the norm, and the white ones kind of die off. And this is exactly what happens to mosquitoes, for example, where increasingly you will talk about that, oh, mosquitoes are getting resistant to that previous thing we used to do against mosquito. And it's because, let's say, you do medicine X to get rid of a mosquito, but then there are mutations by which, say, even as low as 0.5% of the mosquitoes are resistant to that. But those are the buggers who will survive and have kids, and then the number will just grow, and then within a couple of generations, you've got mosquitoes resistant to that. And this is also how today your bacteria are becoming resistant to antibiotics. It is not that they are learning something and passing it on. By pure accident, a very tiny percentage of bacteria are immune to those particular antibiotics because of some genetic mutation. And within 3-4 generations, that is 100% of the bacteria in play. So what overuse of antibiotics does is it speeds up the process till you have more and more bacteria against which antibiotics can't work. And in a sense, this is an ongoing crisis that a lot of biologists are worried about.
But Amit, as with mosquitoes and DDT, I also want to say in the case of antibiotics, yes, the basic process is correct, but there are features of human application which are truly harmful and which have exacerbated the process. This has to do with the dosage. So imagine if one housing complex in a city will get DDT fogging. Okay, and even if they do it very thoroughly for themselves, it will involve incomplete dosage for the neighboring buildings which were not covered by that fogging. There, you will get mosquitoes who have been given a mild dose and they didn't get killed by the mild dose and they survived. So immediately you've got a selection for the trait of a little bit of resistance to DDT. So in principle, if you did it correctly, that if I had 100 mosquitoes and I thoroughly did fogging, all of them are going to die. The point is, because of partial dosage of DDT, some die, but some survive. Who are the guys who survived? Who had the genes to survive a partial dosage to DDT. Now they're ready with the next generation, that they've already reached partial DDT survival capabilities. Now again the humans screw it up and they do some one colony fogging. I beg you, gentle reader, do not do DDT fogging on the scale of one colony. Mosquito control using DDT needs to be done at a population scale. It's a problem in public health. It is not things for one housing colony to do at a time. It is just wrong. But then we kick off this process and then we climb towards complete resistance. Same with antibiotics. If you actually use the antibiotics correctly, which is, a many weeks course of using antibiotics, the way it works is that the antibiotics drive down the population of the pathogen inside the body to very low counts, and then the human immune system surges back and kills off the last stragglers and you're fully done. Okay, now the problem with antibiotics is within the first 2-3 weeks, you subjectively start feeling better and then people stop using the antibiotic. But at that time, actually, you have not fully decimated the population inside your body. And in fact, those guys surviving in your body are the ones who were exceptionally resistant to that antibiotic. So suddenly in your body, you have bred the pathogens who are more resistant to that antibiotic, and then they will surge back and they will become strong. Each cycle of this imperfect antibiotic use breeds antimicrobial resistance, AMR. Okay, and then this is a societal crisis because the individual incentives are like, look, I'm feeling okay and I'll let it go, I'll stop my antibiotics. I've heard that antibiotics are not good for me. But at the level of a society, one by one, we lose our silver bullets. That we've only got a couple of dozen beautiful antibiotics. One by one, they are being knocked out because the new breeds of superbugs are coming up which are resistant to the antibiotics. So here you see this intimate connection between evolutionary theory, human uses of DDT or antibiotics, and the process of how resistance develops.
Evolutionary theory meets human hubris. I mean, this is such a great example of the complexity of the world on the one hand and the folly of our hubris that we imagine that, we are in charge of things and we are in control and we know what's going on. No, we don't.
And in my last example, I want to go back right to the beginning. I had mentioned Paul Ewald, The Evolution of Virulence, a Scientific American article I read, which just blew my mind. The argument runs like this. Okay, you're sick, there is a pathogen inside your body. Now, let's think from an evolutionary theory viewpoint about what is going on with that pathogen. What the pathogen is trying to do is to utilize the resources of your body to make copies of itself. And then, what was the point of it all? And then it has to jump to another human and infect that other human. Otherwise, there's no point. So let's go to one polar extreme. Imagine a pathogen of extreme virulence. Virulence is defined as the rapacity with which it attacks your body and recklessly uses your resources and kills you rapidly. Okay, so if you get sick and within a day or two you're dead, then that doesn't work very well for the pathogen, because how is he going to get copies out to others? Not that he's thinking, this is just evolutionary theory.
Not that he's a he.
Yeah, not that he's a he. In fact, many of them have no gender. So this takes us to this idea that depending on the complexity of transmission, there is an optimal level of virulence of the pathogen. So imagine that a pathogen gets passed from one human to another very slowly in a very feeble way. Then the only correct survival strategy for that pathogen is to keep the human alive for a long time. Don't exert too much of a tax on the resources of the human, because you have to wait. You have to keep your host alive for a long time. Only then you get a chance to get out. Whereas at the other extreme, if a pathogen is so organized that it is able to readily get out from one human to another, then it has very low compunction. It doesn't care about the host. It can be rapacious and it can have high virulence. So the spectrum of virulence that we see in all the different pathogens that attack us is not random. It is not an accident. It is shaped by evolutionary theory. It is made by their need to keep us alive. Okay, so there's a famous example of this field. It concerns cholera and East Bengal and West Bengal. Okay, so in the early years after independence, there was a better improvement of drinking water and fecal contamination of the drinking water in West Bengal. Okay, whereas in East Bengal things were bad. So the incentives of cholera changed. If cholera was confident of getting through the drinking water and reaching other humans, then it has no interest in keeping you alive. So the cholera in the cholera in East Pakistan would rapidly kill the host.
East Bengal.
The cholera in East Bengal would rapidly kill the host, because it doesn't care, because it knows that it just has to force the host into crazy diarrhea, and that will infect the drinking water supply. It will get through to other people. The interests of the pathogen are done. But in West Bengal, where the improvements of drinking water took place, thanks to the glories of the Republic of India, the incentives of the cholera changed, and the strains of cholera evolved to have lower levels of virulence. Okay, so this is another great story where there is this interplay. And let's think about COVID, that if we have a respiratory illness where by talking to each other we are transmitting illness to each other, that is an extreme level of transmission. And then the pathogen has very low incentive to keep the host alive. And the more dense the population where the evolution of the pathogen is taking place, consider the Mahakumbh in Haridwar, the less is the incentive of the pathogen to keep people alive. And so the winner in a densely populated situation like a Bombay suburban train or a Mahakumbh in Haridwar, the winner out of all the different COVIDs will be the one that is the most rapacious, that imposes horrible resource demands on the host, and which gets through to other people rapidly. It will kill people more rapidly. Whereas if we start masking, if we start social distancing, then the incentives of the COVID change and the COVID becomes milder.
So, I'm really glad that we had that chapter where we spoke about the importance of semantics, because here you are talking about the incentives of COVID viruses.
Look, I'm an economist.
So,
what am I to do?
yeah, so all of these are metaphors, gentle reader. And I had an episode with Chinmay Tumbe on his book, The Age of Pandemics. And an interesting thing to note is that in all pandemics so far, it is not as if we eliminated the strain of virus or flu or whatever that caused the pandemic and killed millions of people. It is just that it naturally evolved in this process till what we are left with is the least virulent, which is why even during COVID, I was pretty confident that in the end, COVID will always be with us, but we'll be fine after a while. And, now it's like you get COVID, it's just a
the magic of vaccines. So a critical milestone was the vaccine rollout And so then, to a significant extent, the vaccine was solving the problem, the strain was evolving. Now, once again, now think of the incentives of COVID when it's hitting vaccinated people.
That too, but even in non-vaccinated times and all the previous pandemics, this is exactly the process
Herd
that happened,
immunity.
what you've beautifully described.
All this conversation around evolution leads to a common mistake of compression of time. Okay, so people hear all this narration about white moths, and then came the Industrial Revolution, and then black moths, and you tend to think that, oh my God, this is all going to happen quickly. This is absolutely not true. Okay, so we've got to bring time into this story and evolutionary timescales. The mutations that happen from one generation to the next have to be small. The reason is that large mutations are generally a mistake. A large mutation happens, the child is a failure, the child either does not survive or does not reproduce, and it just doesn't work. So big changes are birth defects. Okay, tiny mutations are what work. That basically it's a complete mosquito with one tiny change, that it's got a little bit better ability to cope with DDT. You only do small changes from one generation to the next, because otherwise it's too complicated. The machine that we are modifying is so complicated, and the language of the genes is so subtle that if you have too many changes happening, then it becomes a mess. So from one generation to the next, you make small changes. And this is absolutely central. You need hundreds of generations, thousands of generations for these changes to accumulate. So if you think of the example of the eye, the genius of the human eye, the mind-boggling genius of the eagle's eye, flying 2 kilometers above, it can see one mouse walking on the ground.
The mind-boggling genius of the bat's echolocation, no either.
Yeah. So these things do not happen quickly. They happen very slowly. You require this sense of evolutionary time scale, hundreds of generations, thousands of generations, small improvement, small improvement, small improvement. It will grind away, it will polish. It will get to incredible levels of capability, but it will not happen quickly. The unit of evolutionary time scale is not time but generations, because it's actually from one generation to the next that we get change. And I want to show two diverse elements of the world where you can see these things happening very differently. The bacteria inside our bodies generally, as a thumb rule, reproduce every 10 minutes. Okay, so now that's a frightening evolutionary time scale, because in every 10 minutes they're making a new batch, and so in every 60 minutes they're making 6 generations, and so on. So they're just doing mutations and getting to new ideas at a mind-boggling rate.
आधे घंटे में दादाजी पैदा भी हुए, मर भी गए.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, the speed at which the pathogens are evolving, the speed at which the bacteria are evolving. So all of us large creatures in the world actually have a serious problem, because the pace at which we operate is very slow, and coping with pathogens, coping with these bacteria is a huge challenge, and it has been a major evolutionary force which has been reshaping all of us big creatures around the brilliance of the human immune system, which has to cope with all this madness of this explosion of new varieties coming up all the time. At the other end is humans. Okay, so as a thumb rule, humans will make one generation every 25 years. In 100 years, you will have 4 generations. In 1,000 years, you'll have 40 generations. In 10,000 years, you'll have 400 generations. So over a 10,000 year time span, nothing much happens, because in 400 generations, little bit of polishing, not that much happens. So we are mostly like the humans of 10,000 years ago. And that has enormous consequences for understanding everything about us. For example, we talked about diet, we talked about anxiety, fight or flee, we talked about tribalism. All these things are basically where we were 10,000 years ago, because 400 generations ain't much. Or to flip it around, any kind of peace and civilization and rule of law and modernity. Okay, the Magna Carta is 1215, it's like a blink of an eye. It was only the day before yesterday that the Magna Carta happened, and there is no safety and rule of law until you get to the most modern societies. So the human body, the hardware is absolutely not evolved for these modern conditions. So this is a very big factor in understanding the story of evolution, that for each creature you've got to think how many generations are getting done, and that shapes the amount of innovation and experimentation and the pace of natural selection, sexual selection that is going on.
At the risk of leading gentle readers astray with an anthropomorphic metaphor, let me tell you, Ajay Shah, that you and I, we don't play the long game. Evolution plays the long game. So, Ajay, I want to end this episode by leading to our next episode, and I'll tell you why. But I want to end this episode by making a point that I feel very strongly about. And that point seems almost an obvious one. The brain is a part of the body, right? Every cell of our body is designed, as you pointed out, by natural selection, right? So why should we imagine that the brain is not? And yet, many people actually behave that way. For example, when people speak about the differences between men and women, no one will deny that our bodies are designed differently for different reasons. But when it comes to the brain, when it comes to behavior, people will behave as if everything is culture and that is the only thing, and etc., etc., and society is patriarchal, and that causes changes in behavior. Now, yes, society is patriarchal. We need to look at our cultures really carefully, because what our cultures do is magnify and amplify some of the worst aspects of our nature. But a lot of these differences between men and women are actually hardwired into us as well. And it is important, number one, to be aware of these and not be in denial of them. And number two, to not commit the fallacy of thinking, if I might go back to the Izod fallacy and the naturalistic fallacy, that just because it is that way, that it should be that way, that just because those differences exist, that requires unequal treatment. None of that follows. It is important, if we want to understand who we are, why we behave the way we do, to accept that there are differences. Now, the reason I said I'm going to plug the next episode is that, gentle readers, what actually happened, where this episode came out of, was that after we did our episode on alt data, where we spoke about what anonymized internet searches reveal about human behavior, a lot of those in the context of sexual preferences, I was pointed by our friend Aditi to this excellent book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which has Steven Pinker's blurb on the cover. It's by Ogli Ogas and Sai Gaddam, and it is a brilliant, brilliant book. It takes, what Seth Steven Davidowitz did a step further by looking at modern data that we have, modern alt data, and figuring out a lot more about the sexual preferences of men and women, and analyzing those from the perspective of natural selection. Now, when I was young, part of my journey of discovery of natural selection was reading The Evolution of Human Sexuality by Donald Simons, and reading similar books by Jeffrey Miller and David Bass, and all of it made complete sense to me that, okay, I understand that we are different. Why are we different? How are we different? This is the way, these are the ways in which we have evolved. You can understand so much behavior better this way. But A Billion Wicked Thoughts is just a brilliant book, a masterpiece, and laying out a lot of the what, in cold hard data that you cannot dispute, and then going into detail into the why. And it actually confirms all the arguments of Simons and Buss and Miller and Pinker and all the great minds who came before. So that's an episode I'm excited about. And when we were putting together that episode, we said that no, first let us do a talk about what natural selection is, what sexual selection is, because there are so many misunderstandings about all of these. And then we realized that, hey, this will become like a scene on scene 8-hour episode if we try to combine it all into one thing. So we decided to do a two-parter, and the second part, which you're going to see next week, is all about sexual preferences, what we know from the cold hard data about what men want, what women want, how they relate to each other, how we are hardwired, how we can mitigate some of that, amplify some of that, all of that in a package. And I'm super excited about that. So that is next week. So, gentle readers, we are at the end of the episode, and we haven't been doing recommendations for a long time. Comments are angry, readers are getting pissed off. Where are the recommendations? So, for this episode, we actually have a ton of recommendations, a bunch of books which we've really learned this subject from, and we'll put them in the show notes instead of naming them one by one. Do you have any closing thoughts for this episode, Ajay?
My biggest closing thought here is to link up some of the larger things we know in our philosophy. Evolution is the ultimate success story of spontaneous order. That there is no central planner, there is no teleology, there is no objective. The system just keeps evolving on its own, and my God, it does amazing things. And similarly, I would take this same idea and flip it around. Ponder the glory of the human eye, ponder the glory of the eagle's eye. When you see that madness, do you feel the instinct of an engineer that I want to sit down and design the human eye or design the eagle's eye? Then think twice, because this magic is made by a uncontrolled self-organizing system without any designer, and that is how far we can go without getting into central planning, central control, industrial policy, government telling you how to design an eye.
The only kind of eye I don't like, Ajay Shah, is the eye and ego. Freddie flipped with that last joke.